Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Chris Rain. I'm a Kennedy student looking at drug policy, a part of the co-lead the mental health and drug policy caucus at the Kennedy School. This is our third event that we've done, the first time on technology, and we're very excited to have Rachel Nuwer join us today. So before I do an introduction, I've just, in terms of the format for today's conversation, I've got a few questions to ask looking at the incredible work that she's done, but feel free to add questions in the Q&A section or the chat box, and we can ask them. And we've got a few people live in the room as well that might pipe up with some questions as we go. So by way of introduction, Rachel, she's award-winning journalist from the US, has written, I think, interestingly about wildlife poaching and MDMA, and I'm curious to hear the links and how we got there. But wrote one of my favorite books from last year, which is looking at the history of MDMA, where it's come from, where it's going. And so we're very lucky to have her here today to join us. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks so much for having me.
So maybe you can start just explaining to people, and for my mom, who I think is about to watch this program, what MDMA is. Where did it come from?
For the chemistry geeks in the room, it's methylene dioxymethamphetamine. You heard right. It's an amphetamine derivative, so it's a very energetic drug, but it's so much more than that based on the clinical trials that have been in the news lately, but that have actually been going on for the past 20 years. Interestingly enough, well, I think a lot of people in this room or in this Zoom screen, whatever, will, like me, originally associate MDMA with parties, with raves, with teenagers out, doing naughty things they shouldn't be doing in the 90s. In fact, MDMA's origins are way older than that. It was actually synthesized in 1912 by the German pharmaceutical company Merck, and it was supposed to be a blood clotting agent. Well, let me correct that. It was a chemical intermediary on the way to a blood clotting agent that Merck was interested in. So Merck didn't actually want to invent any kind of mind altering drug. They were just, doing their pharmaceutical thing, and out popped MDMA. It took years, we're not sure exactly how many years, but years later for people to begin to realize the psychoactive potential that MDMA actually had. So I'm just going to fast forward to the 1970s now, when MDMA was resynthesized by a rather famous psychedelic chemist named Alexander Shulgin, nicknamed Sasha. So Sasha had been a chemist at Dow, and he had invented this biodegradable insecticide, and that basically got him a carte blanche to do whatever he wanted in the lab because he was sort of their star chemist. He made them a lot of money. And instead of looking at insecticides, Sasha began focusing on psychedelics, and he invented something like 200 brand new psychedelic drugs, and he would try them on himself. If they were interesting, he would give his wife and a trusted group of friends a little taste as well, and they would all sit around in the Bay Area and get high and take notes about these drugs. Some people think that Sasha invented MDMA. That's not true. He resynthesized it. The formula already existed from Merck. But what Sasha did do was bring MDMA back into just social interest. And importantly, he introduced MDMA to a therapist friend of his in about 1976. And MDMA became a catalyst for therapy, starting in the Bay Area and then moving across the US and even into Europe and beyond. But therapists tried to keep this quiet because a few years earlier in 1970, 71, the Controlled Substances Act had passed. LSD had been criminalized. As I'm sure a few people in this room know, LSD was used a lot throughout the 1950s and 1960s as a therapeutic catalyst. Michael Pollan wrote quite exhaustively about that and how to change your mind. So I won't get too much into that, but MDMA kind of plugged right into that therapeutic framework that had existed before with LSD. But again, therapists were trying to keep this quiet because they knew if MDMA attracted the attention of the DEA, that it would immediately get scheduled because this was the height of the war on drugs, and the US federal government was just really rabid to kind of schedule everything under the sun.
And I'll get into sort of I've got three areas of questions: the criminalization, medicalization, and the future. But before we get into those, tell us what inspired you to embark on this project. Yeah, how did your personal interest align with doing this work?
Yeah, totally. So, you mentioned earlier my interest in wildlife. I originally wanted to be a scientist, but I realized in my master's degree in ecology that I sucked at math, and I felt like I couldn't be a good scientist if I couldn't do my own statistics. So I became a science journalist instead. But my passion for wildlife, for ecology, for conservation stuck with me. And originally, I thought, okay, I'm going to devote my career to writing about conservation. So my first book was called Poached: Inside the Dark World of Wildlife Trafficking. And it was a really interesting book to write. I went around to 12 countries investigating like elephant poaching and like rhino horns and tiger bones. And it was a great adventure, but it's also a really depressing topic, just writing about like animals dying all the time and like humans destroying the planet. So when the pandemic hit, I was here in New York City and it was lockdown. And I'm sure as some people here who also experienced really deep lockdowns did, I had more time to sort of think about my life and think about where my career was going and what my priorities were. And I realized that I was craving a new intellectual challenge and just a break from this beat of sort of dead animals. And I'll admit, I was on MDMA at the time. I was pondering this question, and suddenly popped into my mind, oh, why don't you just write a book about MDMA? So, once I sobered up the next day, I started doing my research, and I realized that indeed there was no book about MDMA, which dovetails into the other reason I wrote the book. So there was that personal side of things. I just wanted to do something new, but I knew that MDMA was coming through this clinical trial pipeline, and that if it did get FDA approval for the treatment of PTSD in conjunction with therapy, that people would just need some sort of resource to come to learn about MDMA, to learn what it does, to learn its rich history, all the interesting players that have been involved over the years, all, this drug's strengths, its shortcomings, just some sort of resource that brought all that information together, especially because this is a drug that has a ton of misunderstandings surrounding it.
And an enormous amount of stigma too. I mean,
Exactly.
so heartwarming, I think, to hear you say you were on MDMA when you had this idea. And as a fellow lover of MDMA, it's sort of
Nice.
nice to see people publicly come out and say that they get a lot of value out of it, which I certainly have. And yet it's quite vilified. And I'm keen to understand, through your research, how has it come to be quite vilified and quite stigmatized, and is there truth to that we need to be aware of, that the harms that it does have? And yeah, how through your research, how have you come to understand that balance?
Yeah, for sure. It's a great question. So MDMA, basically going back to those therapists in the 70s and early 80s, there was this tension between this group who really wanted to keep MDMA close, keep it quiet, trusted friends, professional use, and another group, which was basically people who wanted to party on MDMA, who wanted to make money selling MDMA as a party drug. And the therapists even say, it was only a matter of time before MDMA did hit the recreational scene, because when you're not taking it for something like PTSD, it's a drug that makes you feel good, and people want to take drugs that make them feel good. So MDMA escaped from the therapist's couch onto the dance floor, as people like to say, and it became a runaway sensation in the early to mid 80s, when it was still legal, totally unregulated, but not illegal. And there were groups that emerged around the US, especially in places in New York City, on the West Coast, and in Dallas. Dallas was a huge MDMA cultural center, if you can believe it, where the drug just really took off. And from there, it attracted the attention of the DEA, inevitably, and they went to schedule it. I'm going to skip the whole scheduling saga for now, but just because MDMA was made illegal, it was ultimately placed on Schedule 1, which is the strictly banned drugs defined as having no recognized medical use and a high potential for abuse. That did not mean that MDMA suddenly disappeared from the recreational scene. Quite the contrary. MDMA wound up making the leap across the pond, as they say, to the UK, where it really, really took off. it basically created raves because clubs in the UK would close around 1 or 2, and people would just be getting onto their MDMA high at that time. They wanted to keep the party growing, so they started these illegal parties basically wherever they could find. Hence the invention of raves. And raves eventually led to this multi-billion-dollar electronic dance music industry that many of us are probably familiar with today. In terms of stigmatization, though, as MDMA became this cultural sensation, as young people began taking it up, millions of users around the world, this attracted the attention of officials who sought to vilify MDMA as a way of basically winning political power, because they could say, oh, look at these crazy kids, they're melting their brains, they're forming holes in their brains, they're eating away at the foundations of society and all that is moral and good. We have to stop them. So basically, politicians created this frenzy around MDMA. The media was compliant with that and just sort of regurgitating these messages they were told about this being like this evil, harmful drug. And it very quickly became vilified. It was punished dose by dose more heavily in the US in the early aughts than heroin was. And in terms of whether or not that was justified, so as MDMA use became this worldwide sensation, there were deaths that began to be reported. I'll just say that in the 70s to the mid 80s, there was this complete scarcity of deaths because people were using it in a therapeutic context. They were using it more conservatively. But as criminal enterprises got involved in producing MDMA, adulterated substances began to hit the scene, and people also had just no information about how to take MDMA safely. So they would take giant doses of MDMA, or they would take MDMA and then dance in a hot room without taking a break or drinking water for 10 hours and become dehydrated and get hyperthermia. So deaths did begin to occur, but if you look at the number of deaths of MDMA relative to things like alcoholism or other drugs, it's really, really small. But those deaths inevitably garnered crazy headlines, in the UK, in the US, in these places where the drug was really creating a moral panic. So stigmatization got really, really wedded to MDMA, and it still sticks around today.
I might fast forward into the kind of medicalization area, but just want to encourage anyone, if you have questions, including this room, pop them in the chat to make sure we've got plenty to ask after I run out, so there's no awkward silences, which never happens. But okay, so I'm going to jump into the medicalization bit because I found this really fascinating in your book, and I've always thought taking MDMA out at a party and you feel good. And what's the difference between doing that than taking it in a therapist's couch and the kind of conversation there? And there's the researchers you talk about, Gulderland, who kind of coined the term. I understand, like, just around this idea of a critical period that a person takes this psychedelic and there's a point in time which their neurochemistry or their psychology can be reformed. Perhaps you could sort of dig into that, because I thought it was quite a novel thing to learn, that sort of reconcile those kind of two protocols of consumption.
Yeah, absolutely. Gould's research is so fascinating. I'll just take a quick step back for anyone in the room who isn't familiar with the psychedelic assisted therapy model. Basically, the idea with psychedelic assisted therapy, well, first of all, I want to emphasize the importance of the therapy part of this. If you take MDMA and go to a rave, you're probably not going to come out with your PTSD cured. Otherwise we'd hear these miraculous stories, which normally we don't. The therapy is really critical to guiding you through this process and really accessing the therapeutic potential of these drugs. So the idea here is that rather than treating the symptoms of whatever is ailing you, trauma or any other type of disease that's currently being investigated with these substances, you're not just papering over the symptoms as you would with an SSRI or another drug that just kind of numbs you. You're actually getting at the root of what is driving this trauma and making you feel so horrible and act in these ways that have become really, really solidified in your mind over time. So nobody really knew how that worked. There were theories kind of punted about. But again, the neuroscience was really lacking until this researcher Guldolan from Johns Hopkins came around. And she had a theory that MDMA and other psychedelic substances might, in this context of the therapist's office, so in the sudden setting of going into an experience prepared to engage with your trauma and also having someone there to help you navigate that, that MDMA may reopen what's called a critical period. So critical periods, for any neuroscientists in the room will probably have heard of this. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I had not. But they are these finite windows of malleability in the brain that usually occur when we're kids. So think about the ease at which a child learns a new language, and they can learn that new language quickly and also without an accent, and sound like a native speaker for the rest of their life. Whereas if you go as an adult, that usually doesn't happen. Definitely not for me. But these critical periods basically exist to set you up as an adult with all the learning and the skills and the habits that you'll need for a lifetime of success navigating the world. So it's your brain's way of just creating a set of instructions and rules about the way the world works. And critical periods close, and they close for a good reason. If anyone's ever spent time with kids, they're just like completely distracted and everything's like, wow. And it's a wondrous time, it's a magical time, but it's also a time of great impressionability and vulnerability. And you can't differentiate like real from imaginary, all these things. So it just wouldn't be an efficient way for adults to operate in the world. But Gould's theory was that MDMA acts as this precise tool for reopening a critical period for just a little amount of time to reassess all these maladaptive habits that people have built around, in this case, their trauma. And she did test this in mice, which obviously isn't ideal. Human tests would be better, but you can't really dissect people's brains, so it had to be mice. But she did find that MDMA, when given in the correct set and setting, again, that's really crucial, reopens this critical period for social reward learning, which in human terms, that would basically be, how you relate to yourself, how you relate to others. So basically the things that go awry when somebody has trauma, which tends to be, directed at themselves and the way the world is perceived to them. And she also published a follow-up study last year showing that it's not just MDMA that does this. It's psilocybin, it's LSD, it's ibogaine, and even ketamine does it. And really fascinatingly to me, all of these drugs reopen the critical period, but they do so for different amount of times. So ketamine, which has the shortest trip length in humans out of those drugs, has the shortest window of plasticity or reopening for the critical period. Ibogaine, which is a super powerful psychedelic from West Africa or Central Africa, that trip in humans can last like 36 hours. And in mice, it reopened their critical period for a month, and Gould just stopped like recording after that. So this implies that different psychedelics might have different, I guess, power, so to speak, in reopening critical periods and allowing people to readdress their trauma and to come out with enduring new habits and new thoughts about themselves. So this kind of explains why something that you do just 1, 2, 3 times. So in the clinical trials, it was a 3 protocol regimen, can actually change your life. There's nothing else we know like that, but Gould's findings seem to explain why that is, because it's literally rewiring your brain and changing the way you think about yourself and the world.
So like a psychological stem cell in a way.
Nice. I like that.
Do-
Should have used that.
Yeah. I'm sure most of the people on this call and everyone in this room for sure is, very pro post-prohibition. Where do you see, where's the counterfactuals with this work? Where's the holes in the data? Where, ought we to be skeptical about it so that, we don't run ahead in the way that was done in the kind of 80s and 90s?
Yeah.
Where do you see those kind of risks, and what should we be thinking about to bring about the world we want to see?
Yeah, great question. So in the clinical trials, there's been 2 phase 3 trials of MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, and the results were really spectacular. It was like 2/3 of participants, it was a 100-person trial each, came out without even having a diagnosis of PTSD at all. However, I think getting to your question, what about that other third? Most people did have a benefit, but some people did not. So, we really need more research on, who these therapies actually work the best for and under what circumstances. A lot of experts I talk to say, okay, the phase 3 trials are great, but this is only the beginning. There's just so much work to do to tease out for which conditions, for which people, under which circumstances, like can group therapy be introduced? Just lots and lots of questions about like various iterations of this that we need to carefully address. And on the other side, the more we understand about the neuroscience, like Gould's work, the more we can really tailor our approach because we'll understand what is actually happening. There's also a risk that if MDMA-assisted therapy or any psychedelic-assisted therapy is given under bad circumstances, let's say, like if your therapist doesn't have your best intentions at heart, if your therapist doesn't know what they're doing, if your therapist is actually a predator, and something goes wrong during these therapies, because you're in this open state of learning, the harm that can result is going to be so much worse because you're literally rewiring your brain based on this harmful rather than helpful experience. So that's another thing that Gould's research suggests that we need to look out for, and also just explains anecdotal issues that have come up over the years with therapists abusing patients under psychedelic assisted therapy. There's no good way to prevent that from happening. One thing that will help is to make these therapies legal, because right now people who are seeking out psychedelic assisted therapy are having to do so underground, and there's no regulatory body to come to complain, if something goes awry. Legalizing it will not stop bad things from happening from time to time because humans are humans, but at least it'll give people recourse if something does go wrong.
And the consequence, you can lose your license and things like that.
Exactly. Indeed.
Yeah. Do you find that did you go through an experience of doing psychedelic assisted therapy, or when you were researching this, did you see that process happening, and what were some of the insights you had from witnessing that or experiencing yourself?
Yeah, so I have never done psychedelic assisted therapy myself. I describe myself as a shallow user of MDMA. I just like to dance and party. I don't even like to talk on it. I've tried, it's just no. But yeah, some people are so chatty. I'm like, please no. But I have interviewed plenty of people who have gone through it, and these oftentimes, like, I would be crying with them at the end of these interviews because it was just like hearing the traumas that they experienced, whether, it's a Vietnam War vet who basically had PTSD for his entire adult life and only came to this therapy in his late 60s because his wife pushed him to, and just, saying what a relief it was. But to hear basically, he's gone through this lifetime of suffering almost needlessly. Or I interviewed a woman named Lori Tipton in New Orleans, and the number of bad things that happened to her, literally, it couldn't even be a movie because it would be too unbelievable. It would be like, okay, this woman needs a break. But it was just so heartening to hear from them that MDMA-assisted therapy didn't make their lives suddenly perfect, but it brought them this tremendous relief and changed their perspective on things and changed their ability to react to, things that the world just is always going to send our way, whether it's like a small issue or some kind of big ordeal. They just now have the tools to navigate that in a healthy way that is, not harmful to themselves or to the other people in their lives.
You write so beautifully about those two examples. It is quite amazing and remarkable. And also, you kind of in your book, you also highlight the imperfection of it and the long time that it takes, and it's not like immediately people have this experience and they're cured and happy people. Like, there's still the edges of what it means to be a human. But I really like both those chapters actually about those two people. One of the kind of someone that's been on antidepressants since my early 20s and kind of off them, and I had done heaps of therapy and still do. We had someone actually that is new to this area in our psychedelic law class ask about, like, what's the protocol that happened, because basically MAPS is doing psychedelic assisted therapy for PTSD. Different companies are focused on one molecule and one kind of condition. The question that this person asked in this class was like, how are those things connected? Like, how does a person know to, if that one doesn't work, what's the protocol to go to the next one? Have you thought about what that might look like from a mental health system, as these things become available? Suppose you have a particular condition, what will that look like? Like how will the average person access these things? How will they change those things? What is it? Yeah.
Big question. So I'll go back to Gould's research for a second about the differing lengths that the critical period is open for. So maybe if you just have kind of a run-of-the-mill depression, you can do ketamine because your critical period is only open for a couple hours. If you have something really intractable like a long-term addiction to opioids, you can do ibogaine. But ultimately, it's also going to come down to the science we have. So unless you're seeking these things out illegally underground, you're going to have to do what has been approved by the FDA. So MDMA-assisted therapy is being approved for PTSD. That said, once assuming it is legalized and approved for that, therapists can prescribe it off-label, which happens for all kinds of medicines. It's really common. So it's going to be interesting to see what kind of off-label prescriptions come up with MDMA. There's other clinical trials going on for things like depression with psilocybin, alcoholism with MDMA, anorexia with MDMA. There's all kinds of different avenues of research going on and like things to be treated, but at the end of the day, it might also come down to your personal preference and what works best for you. Again, we don't know like why some people responded so well to MDMA and others didn't. Maybe those others will respond well to psilocybin or to ibogaine or to some other substance that is being investigated. But we need legal channels to access those substances. Right now, MDMA is the only one that's under review by the FDA. MAPS's like pharmaceutical branch submitted a new drug application to the FDA in December. And just a couple days ago or a few days ago, the FDA accepted the application and fast-tracked it. So there should be an answer by August this year, whether MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD has federal approval, which is really just going to kind of throw open the gates for potential off-label prescribing and also this new world of psychedelic assisted therapy, which weirdly enough, no drug model like this has ever been approved before. So a drug with a therapy component. It's always just, okay, here's your pill, go home and take it. So it's going to be really interesting to see how it turns out. I'm quite concerned that a lot of people are going to be left out, that this is going to be a treatment, accessible only to those with money, those with time, those with resources to get to a center. Because it's going to be really expensive. It's going to be, it's not the drug necessarily that's expensive, but the therapist's time, because you have to meet for prep sessions. Then you have your actual on-drug sessions, which are like 7 or 8 hours each, 3 of those. And then you have integration sessions afterwards to talk about what you learned and how you're going to fit that into your life. So paying for all that therapist time is a lot. MAPS is working really hard on getting insurance coverage of this, and payers do express interest in it, but not everyone has insurance. We live here in the US. So there's talk also about partial payment schemes or even free services for people who can't afford it. But how, if at all, that stuff all shakes out is a complete open question.
But there's from a financial incentive perspective, if you can, for those 66% or whatever it was in that trial, to get someone to go from decades of having a PTSD condition to not having that or having a much lesser condition, that means that they're able to work, they're able to
100%.
and all the kind of emotional kind of damage that happens around someone with a condition like that, it is much less. And so there's a lot of value that can be created in a short amount of time. When I kind of compare that to the traditional models of mental treatment for mental illness, which is, you get on pills, which I've been on, and, or in the case of PTSD, often there's a lot of pain killer medicine, pain medicine, and for long periods of time, which then create a lot of problems down the road.
Absolutely.
So it's more expensive, shorter burst, but in a way, kind of all mental health should have that drug and therapy component, but we just haven't done it that way.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's a real paradigm shift. And it seems like insurance companies do get that point you're saying, because they're like, yeah, it's going to save us money in the long run, which is kind of an awful way to think about things, but it's just the way the system works.
Totally.
Yeah.
So I've got 3 more questions that are focused on the future, but yeah, encourage anyone you got a question, cool. Pop it in the screen, in the chat box. And yeah, if anyone has any questions for Rachel, please chuck them in there. So kind of coming to school here, I sort of thought I'd come here and focus on decriminalization in the future, but I think I've come to the camp that the future medicalization is the path forward, because it makes it safer for kind of it makes it safer to kind of bring it onto the market, and then ultimately, perhaps it goes into the recreational realm.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts around what are your thoughts around how might be commercialized or legalized into the future? Well, given it's sort of never been done before. Yeah, any sort of insights around that from writing a book?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as an MDMA user myself, as we've talked about, I definitely want it to be legally regulated, not just for medical use, but for recreational use as well. And that's just from a harm reduction perspective. Like we were talking about earlier, people right now have to buy their drugs illegally. Maybe you have a chemist friend, but the vast majority of people do not. And you have to go to dealers. You don't know what's in it unless you pay for additional testing services yourself, not only for impurities, but also for the percentage of MDMA, so you're not accidentally overdosing yourself. Like in the UK right now, there's been pills that have been found that are like 450 milligrams, which is several times the dose that an average person should be taking. So you can easily overdose on it. A regulated market would get around that. We've seen over the last decades that the war on drugs has not worked. People like to take drugs. People are going to find ways to take drugs and alter their consciousness. This is just something that is deeply ingrained in our species and many other species that we share this planet with. So just for a safety perspective, like a regulated trade would really reduce so many of the harms that come from MDMA and other substances as well. A source I spoke with even said that in his reckoning, basically all the deaths of MDMA are somehow connected to prohibition. And that's reflected in the fact that in these clinical trials, nobody has had a serious medical reaction. No one has died. Nobody has had a heart attack or had to go to the hospital or anything like that. So, if you know what you're taking, and if you're taking it in a controlled setting and you're empowered with the knowledge about how to take it, then it can be pretty safe. In terms of what that would actually look like, there was a really interesting study done a couple of years ago, I cited in my book, in the Netherlands. And basically this group of experts got together and they evaluated all the different paths that could be taken with MDMA, from absolute prohibition to legalization and regulation. And they examined what each of those paths would look like in terms of outcomes for society across like a whole bunch of different measures. From criminal justice to health, to like, tax revenue, all these things. And they came to the conclusion that just regulating MDMA would be the best thing for Dutch society across the board. And I think that would be the case anywhere, I would hope. In the same way we regulate drugs like alcohol or nicotine, regulate MDMA. And sure, there's still going to be harms that come from it, but at least it's a regulated trade, and yeah.
All on board. So one of the questions from our participants here is, what are your thoughts on how to get providers trained on psychedelic assisted therapy, especially given the shortage of mental health professionals in the US as is? How do we get that done?
Yeah, that's a good question. A little bit outside of my wheelhouse, but I can say that there's a bunch of people who are like way more qualified than me that are thinking about this and are doing what they can to really onboard, thousands of therapists to meet this demand that is predicted to exist if and when MDMA is legalized. So MAPS has its own training program, but there's a lot of different places that do their own training, maybe based on MAPS or something else. So in terms of how to scale that up, yeah, that's outside of my expertise, but I'd love to hear anyone else's thoughts who has more insight on that.
Right. Feel free to pop any comments or thoughts in the chat box. Here, thanks Vince for typing an essay. Yeah.
Nice.
This is basically a conversation with Vince, just written in the chat box.
Oh yeah.
So oh, Natalie's gone. Oh, you got a second chance.
Nice.
All right. Curious to hear your take on how dangerous pure MDMA actually is. I grew up thinking it was quite bad for me, and when I was younger, it does seem a lot more unhealthy things used to be added to MDMA. But as MAPS publishing their recipe, it seems pure and pure MDMA will be available in the future. I know the clinical trials have had a few serious adverse effects, but there's been surprising little research on impact of neurons, cognitive decline. Do you think we should be cautious about that, or are health concerns likely to get overblown?
So there were millions and millions of dollars pumped into research in the 1990s, including at labs at Johns Hopkins, especially, basically seeking to not answer the question, is MDMA neurotoxic, but to prove that MDMA is neurotoxic. You know, like all this federal funding was going into this proof. And after, you know, over a decade of research, it seems that MDMA is much less neurotoxic than other things like alcohol, for example. MDMA has detrimental effects if you do it too often, but it's subjective about how often is too often. So psychiatrists I talk to will say, yeah, you know, I'll have a patient who said there was this time, you know, this year when I was just doing like way too much MDMA, like every weekend or like multiple times a week. And I was having some memory problems and just feeling really burnt out, but then I stopped and I got better. So anecdotally, at least, it seems like, yes, some people develop this just behavioral habit of doing too much MDMA, and they might seem kind of out of it for a while, but once you actually stop and let your brain recover, things get better. The most interesting and maybe best study on this that I know, I cited in the book, actually took place with Mormon users. That's right, Mormons. I just wanted to repeat that in case, yeah. So an issue in studying this question in humans is that MDMA users tend to be polydrug users. You know, they like their ketamine, their alcohol, their coke, like whatever else. So you can't isolate any behavioral effects that they're experiencing just to the MDMA. And researchers were struggling with this until lo and behold, a Mormon MDMA fan wrote a letter to someone at Harvard, actually saying, hey, I know a population of MDMA users who can help you get around this question of, you know, confounding variables. And it's all these Mormons here in Salt Lake City who love to go to raves and do MDMA, and they don't do anything else, not even alcohol. And the great thing about this study also is they had a control group of Mormons who also would go to these raves but not do MDMA, and were also abstaining from all other substances. And at the end of the study, they found a few like very slight variations in these user groups, but it wasn't things that would be noticeable in your everyday functioning, you know, like less dexterous with your left hand or something like that. So, you know, I think as long as you use it responsibly and kind of pay attention to what your own body is telling you, you'll probably be okay. But we do definitely need more research on this question.
Good. I only use my right hand to rave, so
Woo.
I'll be all right. So a question here from our resident HBS Drug Caucus alumni. So a key part is getting access to coverage from payers. What have you seen around like the reimbursement models? How is that going to work? You know, have you seen any examples of it being covered or those conversations happening in your research?
Yeah, so conversations are 100% happening and have been for years, led by MAPS. But since it's not approved yet, we don't really know how it's going to work out. But yeah, the plan is to get everything covered by payers, the therapy component and the drug component. The drug will be sold for the first 5 years by MAPS. They just spun out a new pharmaceutical company called Lycos. So they'll have like data exclusivity on MDMA. Interesting point, MDMA hasn't been patented. Well, it can't be patented because the patent ran out from Merck. But anyway, they'll have data exclusivity for 5 years, sell the drug, and therapists will be compensated separately. But the plan is to get payers to cover the whole thing. The intricacies of that are like way beyond me.
It seems like, yeah, sort of the tracks are being created as the train is going, and a bit, you know.
Exactly. Yeah, I had a source say that. Yeah, we're laying down the tracks as the train leaves the station. Exactly.
But in a way, I think even from a payment model and a reimbursement model, if this paradigm is effective quicker, perhaps that'll put pressure on, you know, SSRIs and their association with and matching with better therapy, as opposed to just putting someone on a drug and, you know, off you go and help yourself. So it could have some, you know, broader impacts on payments in the, you know, the rest of the mental health field anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
So I've got another question from that, which is a very vexed
Nice.
one, and one that sort of comes up at Harvard a lot around sort of plant medicines, and I think probably kind of the issue of like this work being done within Indigenous culture, and now is in a lab, and you know, have you seen organizations handle that complexity well, and you know, at least lead the conversation in some way that is valuable?
Yeah, that's a really complex and important issue. MDMA is a little bit, I don't want to say immune, but just MDMA doesn't have so much complexity here because, again, it was synthesized in a lab, as Natalie pointed out. So I haven't really heard a lot of discussion in MDMA in this context, but it's definitely something that affects a whole bunch of other substances. So I'll just pull an example that I've worked on, which is iboga, which is the African shrub from which most ibogaine is derived. That's that really powerful psychedelic we were talking about earlier that like sends you on a trip for 36 hours. And some people use it to break themselves of addictions to other substances. And interestingly, without any of the negative health side effects of detoxing. So ibogaine is gaining popularity here in the US. You know, places like Kentucky have even talked about using some of their settlement from the opioid companies to do research on ibogaine in the hopes of curing people of their addictions. But there's this talk of reciprocity to Central Africa, especially to Gabon, where this plant originates. So, you know, ibogaine is being synthesized in labs here, but it's also being stolen from Gabon. You know, people go in there, like dig up these iboga trees and then smuggle them out of the country to be used at fancy clinics in, you know, Mexico or Costa Rica and treat Americans or Europeans who are visiting. So like in that example, I would say that the West is really failing because there is no reciprocity scheme with Gabon. The Gabonese people want some sort of reciprocity, and they've also started this fair trade iboga program, a group called Blessings of the Forest there. I did a big story on them for National Geographic last year. They got permission to export iboga legally to Canada under the Nagoya Protocol, which deals with issues of fair trade and reciprocity. But they've only had, I think, one person or one company import their iboga. Yet there's all this like iboga and ibogaine stuff going on. So I think there's a lot of talk in this field about reciprocity and, you know, inclusivity. But then when you come down to it, it's like a lot harder to implement, or maybe people just don't want to take the time to do it. I can't really speak to other substances because I haven't looked deeply into them, but it's a huge issue. But one that MDMA is a little bit apart from.
Knowing what you know now, what advice would you give to your family and friends on how they ought to think about using it?
Yeah, I try not to be like an MDMA cheerleader. I'll maybe like suggest it once and then just step back. So I'm not this like person just badgering people to do MDMA. I would definitely, I tell everybody to test their drugs. So I use a nonprofit in Spain called International Energy Control. If you just Google Energy Control Spain drug testing, they're great. It's a real lab, and you can send them a small sample and they'll test it not only for impurities, but also concentration. So you're not taking too much MDMA, but you're also not taking too little MDMA. So definitely test your drugs. That's my advice. For anybody looking into therapy, yeah, it's different advice. It's really do your homework, and it's just sort of like good luck trying to find an underground therapist at this time. Unfortunately, since I wrote this book, I've had a lot of people, email me or DM me on whatever platform asking for advice about how to find a therapist, how to get help, and there's nowhere to point them to at this time. So that's unfortunate, but hopefully it'll be changing soon.
And kind of lastly on that note, for students, and we've got students in this group from the law school, from the business school, from the Kennedy School, health school. Which of the organizations for students that are interested in having an impact in this area, or routes that we should think about to work in bringing this about into the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just trying to pull up this Harvard website. So Harvard, maybe everyone in this room knows, but just in case you don't, Harvard just launched a new study of psychedelics in society and culture, which I think is just fabulous, because this is the first program that is looking not just at the medicalization of these substances or like the neuroscience, but how does it affect us as humans? How can psychedelics be used to better well people? All these really, really interesting questions that have traditionally been looked over in favor of looking at like demonizing drugs, or how can drugs be used for mental health. So I definitely encourage people to look into that. I haven't looked into it myself, but if I was a student at Harvard, I would be all over it.
That's Mahindra Center. Is that Mahindra Center? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you just Google it, Harvard Study of Psychedelics, Society and Culture. So I think Harvard students are in a really fortunate position that you have both this culture center, but you also have this new psychedelic neuroscience center. I came to Harvard when I was researching the book to talk to some people there, which is just really cool. You have options for studying psychedelics across the board. Students at other universities may or may not have any options at all for studying psychedelics, but I encourage them to talk to their professors, to email administrators and just say, hey, this is something I'm interested in. I heard at a conference a couple of years ago that there's just been this surge of student interest, undergraduates and grad students asking about this. And the more badgering you do, the more chance that this stuff is going to be offered, maybe not for you, but for the future student. In terms of like volunteering, careers, all that good stuff, I think there's just unlimited opportunities coming up at this time, whether it's in law, in advocacy, in therapy, in neuroscience, just all sorts of opportunities that are just, yeah, ripe for the picking and for the choosing, and that you can Google and find out about.
Amazing. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your experience. And yeah, I would encourage everyone to get the book. It's like a fascinating and very even-handed. Because there we go.
Here it is.
But very well done. It's amazing. Like, I mean, basically, you and Michael Pollan have completely made this conversation valid and justified and unstigmatized. So yeah, thank you so much for your work, and thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, this is so fun. Thank you.
Great. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining. We'll send out some more information about the next event. So we've got Hilary Marston, the FDA Chief Medical Officer, joining next month, and a few more. But yeah, so feel free to join. I'll send an email out. Ciao.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.